In December of 1969, a young man named David Farrant was walking alone along Swains Lane, a narrow, unlit road that runs alongside Highgate Cemetery in North London. It was late. The cemetery wall rose beside him in the dark, and the old iron gates at the top of the lane were closed and chained as usual. He said later that nothing about the walk had seemed unusual until, without warning, he stopped. Standing near the gates, half visible in the shadows between the stone pillars, was a figure. Tall, motionless, not the shape of someone waiting for a bus or cutting through after dark. Something else entirely. Farron stood there for a moment and then walked quickly away. He told people what he had seen, and for several weeks nobody paid much attention. In a few months, the entire country would be talking about it. Highgate Cemetery was opened in 1839 on a hillside overlooking the city of London. The Victorians designed it to be magnificent, a place where the wealthy dead could rest in appropriate grandeur, surrounded by Gothic stonework, Egyptian revival archways, sweeping cedar trees, and vaulted underground catacombs that extended deep beneath the hill. Over the following decades, some of England's most notable figures were buried there, and the cemetery became one of the most architecturally elaborate burial grounds in Europe. But by the 1960s, the organization responsible for maintaining Highgate had run out of money. The grounds were essentially abandoned. The ivy consumed the headstones. Trees grew up through family vaults. Paths vanished beneath decades of uncollected leaves. Crypt doors warped and cracked. The cemetery fell into a deep, spreading silence that had nothing to do with respect for the dead and everything to do with neglect. Local teenagers began climbing the walls at night on dares, and the rumors that had always surrounded old cemeteries, the low-level unease that such places naturally generate, began to intensify into something more specific. Something was being seen inside those walls, and not just by one person. In the late 1960s, two schoolgirls walking near Swains Lane reported something that shook them badly enough that it stayed with them for years. They claimed to have seen figures moving among the graves near the far wall, not walking the way people walk, but moving in a way that didn't quite follow the logic of human movement. The story circulated quietly through the local community. Then a man named Keith McLean reported seeing a gray, gaunt face staring at him through the cemetery gates one night as he walked past. Then David Farrant had his December encounter. Then others came forward separately with descriptions that lined up in ways that were difficult to dismiss. A figure of unusual height, unnaturally still, with eyes that seemed to reflect the light when there was very little light to reflect. By early 1970, the local newspaper, the Hampstead and Highgate Express, had begun receiving letters. On February the 6th of that year, David Farrant's letter was published. In it, he described his own sighting and asked openly whether anyone else in the area had seen the same thing. The paper printed it, possibly expecting a few curious responses. What they received instead was an avalanche. Letters poured in from residents across the neighborhood. A couple walking their dog past the cemetery gates late at night. A man who had felt an overwhelming compulsion to flee while standing near the north gate. A woman who described a cold that arrived suddenly and vanished the moment she turned and ran. The letters kept coming. And then a second person stepped into the story, and everything changed scale. Sean Manchester was a self-described occultist, paranormal investigator, and bishop of an independent religious order. He had been following the Highgate Cemetery reports with deep interest, and after reading Farrant's letter in the Hampstead and Highgate Express, he wrote his own response and sought out interview opportunities. In February of 1970, Manchester appeared on ITV's Thames Television evening news program and made a declaration that was, to say the least, extraordinary. He told the interviewer that Highgate Cemetery was home to a vampire, not a metaphor, not a folk legend, but an actual undead entity. He described it as a medieval nobleman from Wallachia, the historical region of Romania, whose remains had been brought to England in a coffin by a devoted follower in the 18th century. The nobleman had been buried somewhere beneath Highgate's overgrown grounds, and Manchester claimed that satanic rituals performed in the cemetery during the 1960s by occult groups using the grounds at night had reawakened it. The interview was broadcast across London, and the story, which had been growing quietly for months, suddenly became something impossible to contain. Reports of dead animals near the cemetery had been circulating through local conversations since at least 1969. Foxes mostly, found near the walls or just beyond the perimeter, dead in ways that seemed strange. Not hit by vehicles, not visibly injured in the ways that injured animals normally appear. The bodies looked drained, pale and slack in a way that unnerved the people who found them. London has always had a substantial urban fox population, and dead foxes were not uncommon sights in certain neighborhoods. But these particular animals drew attention because of how they looked and because of where they were found, and the word that neighbors kept reaching for. The word that felt wrong to say out loud but kept presenting itself anyway, was the same word that had started appearing in connection with the figure at the gates. Meanwhile, visitors who had entered the cemetery during this period, some legitimately, some by climbing the walls, reported experiences that went beyond simply seeing something unusual. Several described a feeling of absolute cold that descended without meteorological explanation. Others described a paralysis, a sensation of their legs simply refusing to cooperate, their body acting on some instruction their conscious mind hadn't issued. One reported hearing sounds from inside a sealed mausoleum on the western side of the grounds. These accounts were collected by Farrant, by Manchester, and by journalists covering the story, and they were published or broadcast across local and national media throughout the early months of 1970. Then came the night that transformed the Highgate vampire from a local news story into a national spectacle. On the evening of Friday the 13th of March, 1970, Sean Manchester appeared on Thames Television again. He spoke about the vampire. He described the threat. He named Highgate Cemetery as the location. The broadcast was watched across London, and by some mechanism of collective human impulse that is both entirely understandable and completely astonishing in retrospect, a significant portion of that audience decided to go there. That same night, immediately, before midnight, crowds had begun gathering at the iron gates of Highgate Cemetery on Swains Lane. By the time the night was fully dark, estimates placed the crowd somewhere between 100 and several hundred people. They had come with wooden stakes, crucifixes, garlic, mirrors, religious pamphlets, and homemade tools. Young men carried hammers, some brought rope, People who had never given serious thought to the supernatural in their adult lives stood outside a Victorian cemetery in North London in the cold, in the dark, on Friday the 13th, preparing to hunt a vampire. What followed was chaotic in a way that is almost impossible to fully reconstruct. People scaled the cemetery walls from multiple directions simultaneously. The old gates were pushed and pried. Groups of people moved through the overgrown grounds in the dark with flashlights, spreading out across the paths and pushing through the undergrowth between the graves. Vault doors were examined. Some were forced. Coffins were reportedly disturbed and opened. Police arrived and began attempting to remove people from the property, but the crowd was too spread out and too energized to be quickly contained. Officers were pulling people off the cemetery walls, while others were already deep inside the grounds. It took hours to clear the site, and by the time the cemetery was emptied and secured, meaningful damage had been done to an already fragile and historically significant place. This single night of chaos would have long consequences, but the incidents at Highgate were far from finished. In August of 1970, 5 months after the mob descended on the cemetery, police responded to reports of a trespasser on the grounds after dark. They found David Farrant inside the cemetery. He was carrying a wooden crucifix and a sharpened wooden stake. He was arrested and charged with entering an enclosed area without permission. When the case went to court, Farrant was ultimately found not guilty on a legal technicality, but the arrest was real, the charges were real, and the items he was carrying were documented and confirmed. Farrant maintained that he was inside the cemetery conducting a paranormal investigation, that he was following up on the ongoing reports of supernatural activity, and that the stake and cross were tools of protection and investigation rather than instruments of violence. The court was not required to rule on the metaphysics of the situation. It ruled on the trespass charge, and Farrant walked free. But the case against him was not finished building. In the years that followed, Farrant remained deeply involved in the Highgate story, conducting what he described as ongoing investigations, publishing accounts of his findings, and engaging in an increasingly heated and very public dispute with Sean Manchester. The two men who had both stepped forward to investigate the Highgate vampire had become, by the early 1970s, bitter enemies, trading accusations about each other in print, in letters to newspapers, and eventually in court documents. The feud between Farrant and Manchester would continue for decades and generate its own considerable documentation. Then, in 1974, David Farrant stood trial at the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court of England and Wales, the most serious criminal venue in the country. The charges against him had grown substantially since his 1970 arrest. He was convicted of damaging memorials in Highgate Cemetery. He was convicted of interfering with the remains of the dead. And in one of the stranger details of a case that had accumulated many strange details, he was convicted of making and sending threatening voodoo-style dolls to police officers who were scheduled to testify against him in court. This was not a rumor or a legend. It was established in open court, acknowledged in the proceedings, and reflected in the sentence. Farrant was sentenced to 4 years and 8 months in prison. He served his time. He was released. He continued for the rest of his life to insist that something genuinely supernatural had been active at Highgate Cemetery, and he published multiple books on the subject. There were other incidents that the cameras and the reporters never fully captured. In early 1971, a partially burned female body was discovered near the entrance to Highgate Cemetery. The discovery was reported by local press and investigated by police. No connection to the vampire story was ever officially established, and the case had its own circumstances and investigation separate from the paranormal narrative that had been building around the cemetery. But the timing, coming less than a year after the mob hunt and amid ongoing reports of nighttime activity at the site, meant that it became absorbed into the growing body of Highgate lore, regardless of what the facts of the case actually were. That absorption is itself significant. By this point, Highgate Cemetery had become a place onto which the neighborhood, the city, and the press projected every unusual event, every unexplained occurrence, every dark corner of local life. Sean Manchester, for his part, did not step back from the story. In his 1985 book, The Highgate Vampire, published by the British Occult Society, Manchester provided a detailed account of his investigation, including a claim that in 1970 he had entered a specific vault on the western side of the cemetery with a small group of companions and discovered 3 lead coffins containing bodies in an unusual state of preservation. He described performing an exorcism in the vault. He claimed that one of the coffins had been empty, and he further claimed that in the early 1970s, he tracked the entity to a house in the North London neighborhood of Crouch End, where he ultimately confronted and destroyed it. Whether any of this happened as described is, to put it charitably, a matter of considerable dispute. What is documented is the book itself, its publication, and its contents, which laid out Manchester's account in full and became the primary text around which the legend was organized and transmitted to later generations. The damage done to Highgate Cemetery during this period, the disturbed graves, the broken vault doors, the opened coffins, was real and significant enough that it became one of the motivating factors behind the formation of the Friends of Highgate Cemetery in 1975. This organization was established specifically to restore, protect, and preserve the cemetery from further deterioration and unauthorized entry. It still operates today. The restoration work they undertook transformed the site from an abandoned ruin back into something approaching its original Victorian grandeur. In a strange and indirect way, the vampire panic contributed to saving the cemetery it had helped to ransack. Today, Highgate Cemetery is open to the public in the daytime under careful management. Guided tours wind through the Egyptian Avenue and the Circle of Lebanon, the grand catacomb ring at the heart of the western grounds. Tourists photograph the mausoleums and the tilted headstones and the cedar trees that have been growing on that hill since the reign of Queen Victoria. The cemetery is considered one of the finest examples of Victorian funerary architecture in existence, and it draws visitors from around the world. It also continues to draw a different kind of visitor, people who come not for the architecture or the history, but for the story. Paranormal investigators still apply for special access. Horror enthusiasts walk Swains Lane at night and point their cameras at the gates. The lane is narrow and dark even today, and the wall beside it is high, and if you walk it alone after midnight, you will understand in a way that is very difficult to intellectualize away why the people who first reported something near those gates found the experience so difficult to shake. What the Highgate vampire actually was, if it was anything at all, has never been established. The panic it generated was real. The damage it caused was real. The court cases, the arrests, the conviction, the voodoo dolls sent to police witnesses, the body found near the gates, the mob with wooden stakes scaling the walls on a Friday night in March. All of that happened. It is in the archives and the court records and the newspaper databases sitting there in black and white, waiting to be looked at by anyone who cares to look. What lived in the graves beneath it is another question entirely, and perhaps it is better, given everything, that it remains unanswered. Some doors are sealed for reasons, and some of those reasons, if you stand on Swain's Lane late enough at night, you can almost feel pressing against the other side. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves dark mysteries, and subscribe to the channel, because the next story might be even more terrifying.